little bit. If you want to start turning there, you can use your digital copies or the copies that are in the seats, or even just hang on and it'll be on the screen for you. But I want to start by reading from Ephesians chapter 4 in verse 1. It says this: "As a prisoner for the Lord, then I urge you to live a life worthy of the calling you have received. Be completely humble and gentle. Be patient, bearing with one another in love. Make every effort to keep the unity of the Spirit through the bond of peace. There is one body and one Spirit, just as you were called to one hope when you were called. One Lord, one faith, one baptism, one God and Father of all, who is over all, through all, and in all." As Troy said, over the past couple weeks, we've been looking at this idea of unity. And man, we live in a world, in a culture right now where there is a lot of division and there's a lot of disunity. And I mean, we could talk forever about the different reasons, and we could have different opinions about the different reasons, and perhaps those reasons and opinions would cause more division amongst us about reasons that there are divisions, and it's just endless. But there's so much division and so many things like that in this world. I thought, man, this is a perfect thing for us to take some time to be talking about. Not just for the sake of talking about it, but could you imagine the example that we could be to the world around us if we would be a people that are united together? Again, not uniformed, that we are exactly the same, we all look the same, talk the same, act the same, but if we could be a people who were united together. And today, we're going to kind of take it a step further from just the people here. We did start out by looking at kind of the fact that a lot of times the divisions that we find within churches, amongst Christians, it has to do with things like selfishness. It has to do with misunderstandings, not taking the time to understand each other. It even can come down to just the very fact of having sin in our lives and allowing the sin to drive a wedge in between us. But there's also blessings in being united. When we take the time to slow up, to get out of ourselves, to get out of the way of other people, when we begin to set ourselves aside, when we begin to work to try and include others, think of others, man, there are so many blessings that we receive, and all of us can kind of be a part of that together when we are united. And then last week, we got very practical. And we talked about some things that we could be doing very practically to try and be a united people. And really, it all kind of centered around the idea of humility, of stepping aside from ourselves. If you haven't been able to be with us over the past couple weeks, you can always go onto our website, smithfieldchristian.com, and listen or watch those messages again and kind of get caught back up on these things, these very applicable things for us to be doing. And I think when we hear this idea of unity, I think when we hear this idea of being a unified people, of being, of the same mind, of the same direction, working together, I think we get that. That's not like a foreign thing, right? I mean, there's lots of different things in life where we need to be united together. Maybe it has to do with where you work. Maybe it has to do with your favorite sports team. Maybe you're watching them and you're like, well, that's the reason you're not winning, because you're not working together as a team. Maybe it's within the family. All of this, there's different kind of situations and scenarios. We recognize the need for unity. That's not the issue, I think. I think what happens, though, is a lot of times when we hear this idea of unity and the blessings that come with being united, we're very aware of them within the church even. And we think about how, of course, God wants us to be a united people. God wants us to work together. But I think the issue that we run into a lot of times, the hang up for a lot of people when it comes to unity, is when that unity kind of steps beyond these walls. And we call for people to be united outside of just our church. When we talk about even being united with churches from other denominations, I think we're okay and we're easy with being Smithfield Christian Church, united and loving and together and having the same purpose and heading the same direction. But when we're talking about uniting with other churches, sometimes it's like, I don't know about it. When we talk about being unified, when Smithfield Christian Church being unified with Smithfield Baptist or Hope Presbyterian or Trinity United Methodist or Christ Episcopal Church or Rising Star Baptist Church or Smithfield Assembly of God or Good Shepherd Catholic Church or Pentecostal Holiness Church of God. And I don't know if you know the trend that's kind of the same amongst all those churches, but those are all Smithfield churches. I did a quick Google search, and I found over 20 churches just in Smithfield, all of various kinds and varieties, all within Smithfield. And Smithfield, is not a very big place. We're talking about 10 and a half square miles is Smithfield. And it's only a little over 8,000 people that live in Smithfield. And I recognize that not all of you live in Smithfield, and I guarantee that those of you who drove from outside of Smithfield coming here passed even more churches of different types and varieties there. And sometimes there can be this feeling of when we talk about connecting with and being united with other churches, it's kind of this feeling of, well, those are other churches. And we're not really expected to be united with them. I mean, we almost kind of view it as kind of fraternizing with the enemy, so to speak. Back in World War I, that was something that was kind of frowned upon, but it actually would happen where sometimes the armies would be connecting and taking time to stop fighting and to sort of connect with each other and spend some time hanging out with each other. I got some pictures for you of some of those. This first one is of the Russian officer and an Austrian officer hanging out, sharing cigarettes or whatever it might be, just talking together. The second one is of a group of German officers or German soldiers and Russian soldiers dancing together out on the battlefield. They're dancing together. Or this third one. Here we have Russian soldiers, German soldiers, and Austrian soldiers stopping, pausing. There's even a dog down in the right corner. Can you see that? Hanging out with the dog and taking pictures together. And sadly, though, this was frowned upon. They were saying, you can't be doing this because it kind of, it made it a little difficult to shoot at your friends across the way, right? But a lot of times, sadly, within the church, we can begin to see other churches as the enemy. Now, this isn't anything new, though. Seeing other Christians, other churches as sort of the competition of the enemy really isn't anything new. And if we go to our passage here in 1 Corinthians, we're going to pick up in chapter 1 and verse 11. Paul is writing to this church there in Corinth, and he's addressing a lot of issues, and this is one of the early on issues in this letter, and he says this. He says, "My brothers and sisters, some from Chloe's household have informed me that there are quarrels among you." Now look, there's going to be arguments and disagreements on things, but I think, man, when I see what they're fighting about, it kind of really hits me in the heart. What I mean is this. One of you says, "I follow Paul." Another, "I follow Apollos." Another, "I follow Cephas." And still another, "I follow Christ." You see, these Christians in this city of Corinth, they were fighting over who their minister or who their pastor was. They were arguing and kind of trying to measure up to each other of who they were calling as their leader. They were making it all about these people, and it was causing fights amongst them. I mean, and as ridiculous as it sounds for them to do that, that still happens today. Oh, you go to that church. Well, I've heard some things about that church. Oh, well, I go to this church, and we do this and this and this and all this stuff. And see, the thing is that many Christians see other churches as the competition. That's how a lot of Christians see other churches. And maybe more accurately and probably more sad, they see it sometimes not only as the competition, but as the enemy. We look at other churches, we critique how they do things or what things that they do. We offer commentary on their beliefs, their way of thinking and practicing things. And look, I'll be the first to admit, I can sometimes fall into that trap where I want to kind of critique what we do based on what I see other churches doing, where I kind of find myself looking over my shoulder at other churches and wondering, okay, well, how are we doing compared to this church or that church? And then I begin to think, well, but we do this, and we have this, and kind of acting like I need to sort of measure up to something. I actually had a friend of mine who is also a minister. He told me once that he hates hanging out with other ministers. He says, "I hate it." He says, "Whenever I get around other ministers, all I hear them doing is just trying to measure up to each other. One of them talks about something they're doing at their church, and the other one has to say, well, at our church, we did that for a little while, but we found that we did this and it's a little bit better. Or, oh yeah, we used to do it, but we stopped doing that. Or, it's just this constant kind of going back and forth, having to one-up each other. And I'll admit that sometimes we can fall into those things and not even realize it. We can fall into those situations and those scenarios and not even realize what's going on. But when we look back into that passage there in 1 Corinthians, that Paul is talking about these different men that where they were getting so excited about and trying to sort of proclaim who was their leader to try and seem who was better, I think it's kind of interesting, the people that were listed there that Paul lists out. And I'll admit that when we look at this passage here, what I'm about to share with you, I think is me reading a little bit more into the passage than what Paul really intended. But I think the principle is really true. If you think about the four different people that he mentioned, the first one being himself, Paul. Paul was a church planter. Paul traveled around, planted churches. churches, and he would go and he would, raise up new leaders, and then he would move on to somewhere else. The second person was Apollos. Apollos was a very eloquent speaker. He was a very knowledgeable man. He was known for his speaking abilities. The third one was Cephas. Cephas was another name for Peter, the Apostle Peter. We all know about Peter. Peter was the guy who was very action-oriented. Like, he was going to hop up and get going on something. He was doing stuff. And then, of course, Jesus Christ, and he's Jesus. And so, we'll just kind of leave him at that. And in many ways, I think that these guys, and again, this is just my kind of commentary and perception on this, I think in many ways, these guys could represent a lot of the different types of churches that we encounter today. Paul could almost represent that multi-site church, the one that's constantly planting sites and campuses and churches all around, kind of the church planting guy. Apollos, he could be the one that represents the churches that are just very, very focused in on discipleship and learning and Bible study and very theologically focused. Peter, being the action guy, could almost be the outreach of the service-oriented church and the one who's wanting to always get going and serve in the community and doing all these things. And I think we can look at these characteristics, and I think in many times we kind of take and we lump churches into these types of characteristics or these types of groups or these types of categories. We might even begin to make commentary on the type of church they are because of that. Well, they're just doing whatever new fancy thing there is out there to grow their church. They're a mile wide but only an inch deep. They might have a lot of people, but there's no real depth to them. Or you may look at like a church like the Apollos church and, well, they only care about Bible studies and they only care about building themselves up. They don't care about the community and there's no fun there. And, when we stand and we can judge and we can make up all these different things and we can decide whether or not they're doing what they should be doing. And we hold our church up, we hold up our pastor, our leaders, our programs, our whatever, and we begin to use that as this measuring stick as if we have it all together. But I want you to look again at what Paul says in verse 13 now. And actually, let me back up to 12 just so we can get the whole thought through there. Again, in verse 12, what I mean is this. One of you says, I follow Paul. Another, I follow Apollos. Another, I follow Cephas. Still another, I follow Christ. But then he says, is Christ divided? Was Paul crucified for you? Were you baptized into the name of Paul? You see, this is a rhetorical question, obviously, Paul is getting at. And in fact, in the original Greek language, when it was written, Paul was almost like borderline sarcastic here of saying, come on, really think about this. Did Paul die for you? Did Paul carry a cross up a hill after being beaten within an inch of his life and then nailed to that cross? And did Paul raise from the grave for you so that he'd conquer sin and death for you? No. You see, we miss the point when we make it a competition. When we make it all about looking at other churches and who's got this and who doesn't have this and what's it all about. When we look down the street or across the town or even, now thanks to the internet, when we look around the world at other churches across the web and we start to gauge the value or the effectiveness and so many other things, all based on different criteria, man, when we start doing that, we miss the point of what this is all about. You see, and just before Jesus left this earth, just before he finished his ministry here on earth, you know what he did. He gathered his disciples together. He gathered his followers together, and he told them this. It's recorded in Matthew 28:19. He says, go and make disciples of all nations. And that's what he told them to do. And then he followed that up with a little bit more instruction of how to do that. He says, baptize them and teach them. And then he left. And then he left it at that. And there's no real specifics of, and then the way you do that, and the time you do that, and the purpose there's no real specifics of all that. If you look throughout the New Testament, we see a lot of commentary and examples that we then use to base a lot of what we do upon those things. But Jesus didn't give us specifics to be able to say, well, this is how you have to do it, and this is when you have to do it, and this is the things you have to do and stuff like that. And in many ways, that can be a blessing for us. To kind of have that freedom, kind of have that open-handedness, to be able to understand our context, to be able to understand our situation and our culture within a town or with whatever it might be, to kind of examine that and say, what can we then do to minister to these folks and to help folks within our own context? But on the other hand, it can also sometimes open it up to people deciding for themselves what they think the right standard should be, what is best, or what churches should be doing. But I want you to think for a second. Did God make every single person the same? No. Now, there are some people that are unique or are similar. We share similar characteristics and things like that. I texted somebody. I told you guys I've gone back to the gym trying to, be a little healthier. And I texted somebody this past week, and I was like, "Hey, I saw you on the treadmill when I was at the gym, and I was about to wave at you, and then I realized it wasn't you. So I'm glad I didn't wave at them." Sometimes we see people that resemble other people, and we're like, "Oh yeah, it's so." Oh no, that's not who I thought that was at all. But for the most part, we are all different. God has made us in unique and different ways, different shapes, different sizes, given us different interests. He's given us different ages that we live to. He's given us different cultures and time periods that we lived within. He's given us different abilities and talents. And we know why God has done this. I mean, we understand why God would make us different. We looked at several times over the past few weeks at 1 Corinthians 12, and we understand the analogy there that Paul uses of the body, of how we need all the different parts. And so my point is, if God would make all of us different, each of us, each individual person different, then why are we so convinced that he wouldn't do the same thing with all of his churches? I mean, if God would make us in different kind of personalities and different varieties, why wouldn't God make churches with different sizes, different personalities, different focuses, different abilities, different resources, different methods, but all of them driving at the same thing, to love like Jesus, to go and make disciples? I've had the privilege of working in several different size churches. When I started into ministry out of Bible college, I was very blessed to work with a church up in the Richmond area, and we had like 1,100 people, 1,200 people on a Sunday, on a weekend there at our services. Then after that, we moved down to North Carolina, to Greenville, North Carolina, and ministered at a church there around of 350 people there. And now serving here within a church smaller than that, of under 100 each week. And it's interesting because each of those churches are very different, and the dynamics are very different. And it seems like everybody or different groups have different reasons of why that's the best church or why that's not the right church, all based on size and things like that. Sometimes we look at a large church and we'll say, "Oh, it's just all about the production," right? It's all about the production, and they just want to do everything real flashy in a big way, and and you're just a face in a crowd, and that may be the truth. Sometimes you do that, but I think and Troy has very poignantly shared how the production and the excellence of a larger church was what drew him back into church in many ways. And maybe if you talk to someone within a large church, and even though you may feel like just a face, just a number in a crowd, what if you found out that there actually are more ways to be connected and to grow, more resources within a larger church than even what we have here within a small church family? But then some people may look at a small church and just say, "Well, their facilities are old and aging, and they've only got a gravel parking lot, and there's not a whole lot of space in their foyer right now." And and I think you know where I'm going with this. Sometimes we can even be looked at in our context here of people saying, "Well, they must not be doing the right things because they don't have all of these big things." You see, friends, when we stand at a distance, or even when we go in to that place and we stand there and we judge, then we make it all about us. We make it all about what we think is right. And it's not for us to make that decision. It is our responsibility to faithfully use what God has blessed us with to do the same mission as what Harvest is doing down the road, what Rising Star is doing right down the road, what Smithfield Baptist is doing up the road. It is the same purpose that we all share together. So how can we come together as a church? If this isn't a competition, if we shouldn't be judging and grading other churches, if we should be looking at other churches as a part of this family, what do? And in case you're wondering, do I think that every single church that might hang the name church on their sign is fulfilling the plan that God has for them? Sadly, no. I don't think that every single church does. And I hope and pray that we do our best to make sure we don't ever slip into those kinds of times. But that's not for us to determine. Instead, it's for us to find ways that we can be a unified body for God. And the first way we can do that is to remember that the church belongs to Jesus. Troy kind of joked about it, that this is the Big C church. And hopefully in your notes it even says that, the Big C church. This isn't just this church. This is the church worldwide. My home church, the church I grew up at, that Beth and I grew up at, is over in Hampton. It used to be called the Northampton Church of Christ. And we had one of our ministers for a while there. His name was Chris. And it was funny because Northampton Church of Christ is a long name. And so when you get mail sometimes on like the mailing labels, the T would sometimes get left off. And so it would say the Northampton Church of Chris. And so my mom was the secretary for a while, so she would give the mail to him and be like, oh, I see. You're trying to take over now. You're trying to make this your church and stuff like that. But the truth is that he knew, and we all know, that this church doesn't belong to any one of us. Sometimes, young kids may think that the church belongs to the pastor or something like that. But that's not the case at all. That's why on our sign out front, that's why within our name as a church, that it says that we are a Christian church. Not only is it a description of who we are and what we're all about, but it also reminds us of who we belong to. When Jesus was with his disciples, he asked his disciples, who do you say that I am? And Peter, again, being the action guy, jumped up to the front and he said, well, you're the Christ, or some translations say, you're the Messiah, the Son of the living God. And Jesus responded to him in Matthew 16:18. He says, on this rock, on this declaration, I will build my church. He didn't say, on this rock, on your declaration, Peter, you're gonna build a church for me. No, he said, I'm going to build my church. And so all churches, they all belong to Jesus. No matter what may be on their sign, those churches belong to Jesus. And so could you imagine, if we understand this idea that the church belongs to Jesus, could you imagine for a second if maybe you own a car, maybe you own a house, maybe you own a boat or a camper, whatever it might be. Could you imagine if you found out that other people were fighting over how your stuff was to be used? Could you imagine if you heard about people in the community arguing and picking and fighting, not even about how you were using it, but how maybe other people want to use your stuff? It doesn't belong to them, so why in the world would they fight over that? And the church doesn't belong to us. And so we need to be very careful when we begin to fight over who's doing it right. Now, that first step of remembering that it belongs to Jesus, that's a very big kind of out there step, but I want to get more personal with it. And in fact, I want to challenge us on a very personal level to pray for other churches, to pray for them. Every week, a number of those churches that I mentioned earlier, those local churches, a number of them, they live stream their worship services on Facebook. And a lot of times on Sunday mornings, I jump on Facebook and I watch some of their service. One of the ones that I watch almost every single week that's just kind of on there when I'm kind of prepping and getting ready is Smithfield Baptist. And then when I get up here to the church, Hope Presbyterian has their service going. And I'll turn some of them on and listen to their sermon, listen to their music. I've even gone into the chat and commented in there sometimes and just told them, I said, hey, your brothers and sisters at Smithfield Christian Church are praying for an awesome day for you. Friends, we need to be praying for these other churches because if they aren't the enemy, if they aren't the competition, and if the whole church belongs to God, then we want them to succeed. We need to show them support. In John 13:35, Jesus said, by this, everyone will know that you are my disciples, if you love one another. And like I said earlier, a lot of times we're on board with the whole love one another thing when it comes to in-house, but he's calling us also to love even those Christians that are in those churches down the street. But think about if we were to start praying for other churches like that consistently, regularly, churches that either in this community or near where you live. And I'm just going to assume that you're already praying for this church. But what if we were to even expand that and to pray for other churches? What if you were to find out the pastors' names of these other churches, some of the needs of those other churches, and lifted them up and be praying for them? Maybe even learned a little bit more about those churches. If we all did this, could you imagine the effect that we could begin to have on a community if we were all praying for each other in that way? Well, the third thing I want to challenge you to do is really kind of even more personal and even more of a challenge, and that is to talk openly about your faith. To talk openly about your faith. Now, when I say talk openly about your faith, what I am not saying is starting political arguments with people or berating or belittling people who believe differently or understand differently or bragging about your church. I'm not talking about any of that stuff, right? That's not the kind of the talk openly about your faith, because sometimes we can get really good at that. None of those things are productive. None of those things are helpful. And I honestly don't think a lot of those things are very godly either. But what I do mean is that when it comes up in conversation, When you're talking with coworkers about what you did over the weekend, and to mention, yeah, hey, I was at my church this past Sunday morning, or maybe when you're in the neighborhood and it comes up when you're talking about with your neighbors, or when you're at school with your classmates and you're mentioning to them, yeah, this last Sunday night we went to the corn maze and we got lost forever. We were the last ones that I don't know what it might be. When you're talking to other parents at the baseball field, when you see people in the grocery store and conversations strike up. You see, when we do that, when we begin to talk about our faith openly, what happens is it opens a door. And not only, and there's kind of like two things that happen when that door gets opened. Not only does that door then get opened for you then to invite somebody to come and be a part of a church community, a church family. I got to tell you, my wife is like a pro at this. She's great about like the conversation starts over here, and she's going to get it to, what church do you go to? Trust me, man. And she kind of weaves it around, and then eventually, hey, what church do you go to? Or do you go to a church? And then she has the opportunity to tell about our church here and invite somebody. But the reason I say we should talk openly about our faith in these different contexts, it's not only a good thing to invite people, but when you talk openly about your faith, you open the door for those other Christians to recognize, oh, I'm not the only one here. And maybe you've experienced that. Maybe you've been at work, maybe you've been somewhere, and someone else kind of talks about their church or talks about being a Christian or whatever it be. Maybe it's at school and you hear people talking about that and you're like, oh, cool. Well, they're a Christian as well, and I'm not the only one. Because sometimes we can feel like that, right? Sometimes we can feel like, well, I'm the only Christian here. I'm the only person that believes in God. I got to kind of keep quiet. But when we begin to hear others talking about it, it reminds us and it encourages us. And I have to say, it even sometimes brings about a good level of accountability. Yesterday, we were out at Brennan's soccer game out at Nike Park, and I'll have to admit that I can be kind of a loudmouth parent on the sidelines, where I'm shouting at my kid, and I'm shouting at the team, and I'm shouting at the refs and all that stuff, and so I'm doing my thing, and every once in a while I get a jab from Beth or whatever. I'm trying to be nice, I'm trying to be controlled, and then I look over, and right next to me is actually the pastor, one of the pastors from Harvest, Art Stafford, and I'm like, oh, hey guys, I didn't realize you were there, and I joked with him. I said, well, I guess I got to clean up my language now. There's another pastor here next to me. But it was weird because even though, look, I was not being mean to anybody, I wasn't being bad, but in the back of my mind, every time I'd get ready to start to shout something out to the team, I would think about, okay, should I say this? There's other Christians here. And there's a bit of accountability that comes into this and helps us out when we know that there's other Christians with us. I'm not saying we need to be fake or false, but it kind of keeps us on track. And this great sense of accountability is such a blessing when we know that there's other people with us that have the same faith, whether it is at work, whether it is at school, on the ball field, whatever it might be. And not only can we hold each other accountable, but we can encourage each other. In 1 Thessalonians 5:11, Paul says to that church there in Thessalonica, he says, therefore, encourage one another and build each other up. And again, friends, that encouragement, that building up is not meant to be limited to just within these walls, to just the members of this church, but for us to talk openly about our faith, to tell others about the great God and the great family that we have, and to talk about it and connect with those other people and to encourage each other. I like to watch videos on YouTube sometimes. There's lots of different channels that I'm subscribed to, lots of different things that connect into my interests, but there's one channel that I really love lately. It's called the 10-Minute Bible Hour. I don't know how that math works. You figure it out, but that's what it's called, okay? The 10-Minute Bible Hour. But this guy, he's got a great channel. In fact, I would encourage you to write that down and go find his channel on YouTube. Really great stuff on there. And one of the things that I love is he has a series of videos where he goes and meets other denominations, their leaders, and he goes and he spends a day and they show him around their building, their worship areas, their sanctuaries, whatever you want to call it. And they talk about why they have certain things in their building. They talk about what they do on a Sunday morning or even a Saturday when some of the churches meet. They talk about what they call, it's all these different things, and they just kind of break down all these different things. And something that I love, that I've loved watching and listening, is that as I've listened to this guy talk to these leaders and hear about their churches and hear about the things that they believe and even some of their theology, it's been amazing some of the things where I've kind of said, hey, yeah, I agree with you on that. Instead of driving past those churches and saying, oh, it's that church. Oh, I would never go to that church. It's so refreshing. It's so encouraging to hear just many things within those videos, those different leaders talking about the things that they do, the things that they believe, the things that they understand about God's word and what he wants for us as God's people. And for me to be able to sit back and say, yeah, I agree with that. Yeah, I'm right with you on that one. And sure, there are several differences. Then there's even some very distinct differences, but there's a lot of similarities there. And I think if we would learn to find and focus on those similarities and find that common ground, and even develop some connections and relationships with those other Christians, man, I think we would be amazed at kind of the way that it would not only enrich our own lives, but also be a blessing to them and even a blessing to our community. I want to encourage you to check out that channel. I want to encourage you to be praying for other churches. And believe it or not, I even want to encourage you to go and check out and worship with some of those other churches. But come back, okay? Come back when you're done with that. To be gone on a Sunday and to go and worship with another church is a really great thing, and we've been blessed to be able to do that sometimes. And I want to encourage you to do that because we've got to recognize that, man, this is not it, folks, okay? We're not all of God's church. There's so much more out there, and together we're on the same team, and hopefully we're heading in the same direction, and we can be a blessing together for God's kingdom. So as we wrap up, let me pray for us, and let me pray for them as well. God, I thank you for our big family. I thank you for this family that spans way outside of these walls. I thank you for this family that spans even outside of our state, of our country. And it is so amazing and encouraging to know that there are Christians on the other side of the world that have already spent hours doing what we're doing right now. There are Christians that are still waiting on their service to get started. And God, I think sometimes we can forget about them. We can forget that there are others in this world who are experiencing the same joys, who are going through the same hardships, and many are even going through more desperate times than us. God, would you help us to remember those folks? Not only in a passing thought, in a fleeting moment, but God, would you help us to remember them and to love them and to support them and to find a way that we can be a blessing to them, knowing that we are on the same side. We are on the same team. God, I pray that you would help us, Smithfield Christian Church, to do our part as we are a part of your larger church. God, thank you for this series and this opportunity that we've had to study on being a unified people, about being united together. God, help us to take that and to put it into practice, to put it into action, and to follow you and to be your people. We pray this in Jesus' name. Amen.